Well, good afternoon. I'm Scott Callan, and I'm the Executive Director of the History Center in Tompkins County. So I do want to welcome you to the History Center and to our new traveling exhibit we're hosting, Dreaming of Timbuctoo. Thank you for joining us today. I'll be brief with my introductory comments and then hand it over to Professor Washington. But I do want to say a few words of thanks before we get going to the lead sponsors making this exhibit possible here at the History Center. We owe a great deal of gratitude and thanks to the Ithaca College Office of the Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs, the Cornell University Department of History, and the Cornell University Office of the Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion. We also have some co-sponsors on the project: Cornell University Departments of American Studies and Government, the Cornell University Library, and the Cornell Public Service Center. I do have a few people and individuals I'd like to thank specifically. Tops among that list is Professor Margaret Washington for being so instrumental in getting this exhibit here to the History Center and here in Tompkins County. Likewise to John Suter, one of our past board presidents here at the History Center. Roger Richardson at Ithaca College for taking the first big step in making this a reality here. And then to the folks at John Brown Lives, including Martha Swan, for developing a really terrific exhibit. We got a lot of great feedback at last night's. Now I've got the great honor to introduce a terrific panel today. Margaret Washington joined the Cornell History Department in 1988 as associate professor. Her specialties are African American history and culture, African American women, and Southern history. She is one of the foremost authorities on the Black experience. Dr. Sean Eversley Bradwell at the far end of the table is an assistant professor at Ithaca College.
I'll take the promotion though.
We'll put the paperwork in today.
Sounds good.
He serves as the co-coordinator of the African Diaspora Studies minor in the Center for the Study of Race, Culture, and Ethnicity, and has research interests and teaching interests in educational policy, race theory, and hip-hop culture. Candace Kutungi is a PhD candidate in Department of History at Cornell University. She received her bachelor's degree in ethnic studies and political studies from the University of California, San Diego, and earned her master's degree in African American Studies at Cornell University. Her dissertation, Pioneering Race Women, Black Women's Activism in the Antebellum North, 1820 through 1850, looks at the centrality of spirituality, education, and community service in Black women's activism, and offers a critical analysis of the ways in which African American women have been marginalized within the historiography of antebellum activism. Finally, Daegan Miller is a graduate student in 19th century American cultural and environmental history at Cornell, and he's been dreaming of the Adirondacks ever since his first backpacking trip to the mountains in 1996. He caught sight of something in those woods on that first trip, something he's been pursuing ever since, and he's chased after it on foot, snowshoes, and skis. He chased it for 4 years as a high school history teacher, and those 6 years so far at graduate school. He hasn't gotten close to whatever it is yet. I'm reading Daegan's bio verbatim as he wrote it. I thought there was no sense in changing it. It read so well. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Professor Washington as today's moderator. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming. Dreaming of Timbuctoo was produced by John Brown Lives and the Essex County Historical Society. It was curated by Amy Godine. John Brown Lives was founded in 1999 to promote social justice and human rights through the exploration of issues, social movements, and events, many of them rooted in the Adirondacks and in New York State. And I am on the John Brown board. I'm very, very happy to be a part of that organization. My ideas about bringing Dreaming of Timbuctoo to Ithaca was to help put into action what I consider to be a sort of a local initiative generated by our community read project last year, Dr. Martin Luther King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. Just as Dr. King took the concept of community globally, it also has a deep message locally. Our Ithaca community includes not only us permanent residents, but our campuses as well. It is in the spirit of sharing and the reading of Where Do We Go From Here, and the hope that that can be a reality and the vision contained in that book, that this community project, Dreaming of Timbuctoo, has meaning. But Dreaming of Timbuctoo has a deeper representation for us as a nation, and this was also part of my interest in bringing the exhibit to our community. I hope that this symposium that we have arranged, that we can dialogue about citizenship this election year, about local history, about Black history and Black leadership, about communalism, about John Brown, Gerrit Smith, biracial cooperation, and why the settlers called it Timbuctoo. We want to leave ample time for audience expression, comments, observations, and questions. In 1817, Daniel Tompkins, the governor of New York State, prepared to assume his new office as Vice President of the United States. Tompkins badly wanted to leave office with a statute that would abolish slavery in his state. He was successful. A law was passed in New York in 1817 that would abolish adult slavery 10 years later, on July 4, 1827. The Emancipation Law was a long time coming, and while it still left children in servitude, the state could look forward to a future when no enslaved people would be in the state, at least by the 1840s. Unfortunately, while what New York State gave with one hand, it took with the other. In 1821, ahead of that adult abolition, a state constitutional convention was called, which granted universal suffrage to all white males. The convention simultaneously restricted suffrage to Black men unless they owned $250 worth of property. That, at the time, was approximately $4,000. The new law obviously disfranchised a large majority of Black men just as they came out of bondage. New York had the largest Black population in the North and the most articulate, outspoken Black leadership. They did not suffer in silence. Throughout the pre-Civil War era, Black leaders petitioned the state legislature to give the right of voting to all male citizens of the state on the same terms without distinction of color. The state legislature repeatedly voted down these petitions. In 1839, a group of young Black men established a standing correspondence committee to oversee cooperation among Blacks throughout the state and draw up petitions to the legislature. Many of these men were the same ones to whom Gerrit Smith granted land. These men canvassed the wards in every town and city and finally organized into the New York Association for the Political Elevation and Improvement of the People of Color. This body included women. Even though the primary political aim of the Black Northerners was to end slavery in the South, they understood that their own inequality was part and parcel of the socioeconomic issues that fed bondage. They joined with Gerrit Smith and other whites to form the Liberty Party in 1840. The goals were twofold: to use the political apparatus of the nation to end slavery and to create equal citizenship rights. The Liberty Party, as an anti-slavery and equal rights party, never gained a real foothold in the political process, but some of the adherents would later emerge in the Republican Party. In 1846, African Americans in New York mounted a suffrage campaign in the form of a statewide referendum to secure voting rights. That referendum met with a resounding defeat. Because of this defeat, the mounting racism in the cities, and the lack of employment, Gerrit Smith offered 3,000 men an average of 40 acres of land in Essex and Franklin counties. We find ourselves, through the mercy of God and the generosity of Honorable Gerrit Smith, under our own vine and fig tree, with none to molest us and none to make us afraid. Those words were written by Blacksville founder Willis Augustus Hodges. And if you've looked at the panels, you know that there were two settlements: Timbuctoo, which was in Essex County, and Blacksville, which was in Franklin County. And Hodges was one of the residents of Blacksville. He was also the founder and editor of the Ram's Horn, which was an African-American newspaper, a by any means necessary newspaper. These settlements were also undercover places for self-emancipated people fleeing Southern bondage, especially in 1850 after the Fugitive Slave Law made every white citizen a potential slave catcher. Blacks and some whites in the Adirondacks used their homes as safe havens. In the words of white abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson, throughout the glorious hills of the Adirondacks, you could see a U.S. Marshal looking for bondspeople 5 miles away. Gerrit Smith became disillusioned with his experiment in the Adirondacks, perhaps because he ceased to believe in the power of American democracy to bring change. When he won a seat in Congress as the Liberty Party man in 1848, he soon resigned. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Law and the 1857 Dred Scott decision further alienated Smith. Chief Justice Roger Taney in 1857 wrote, "It is too clear for dispute that the enslaved African race were not intended to be included and form no part of the people who framed and adopted this Declaration of Independence. Moreover, all blacks, slave as well as free, were not and could never be citizens of the United States. A black man," he wrote, "has no rights which a white man is bound to respect." That same year, Gerrit Smith became one of John Brown's Secret Six, men determined to bring the crisis in freedom to a head by any means necessary. As for black male franchise in New York, that was only accomplished with the ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870. Thus, the majority of black men in New York State obtained the franchise at the same time as newly freed black men of the South beyond the Mason-Dixon line. Today, a black man sitting as President of the United States seems to be a fitting tribute to the courage and the struggle that African Americans and white allies waged for equal voting rights. But that struggle for full citizenship continues, as we currently witness the designs of some states to circumvent and even eradicate through voter identification laws the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Media interviews with Americans who insist that they will vote for anyone who can, quote unquote, beat Obama, suggest the acceptability of racially tinged schemes to keep the highest office in the land as a white man's purview. Such thinking makes the election of Barack Obama seem more like a fluke, rather than our society finally joining a world that embraces women and minorities as heads of state. Americans who are concerned about the attempts to eradicate and redesign the Voting Rights Act should realize that devious ways of restricting suffrage are not new. In 2012, this year, 2012, a presidential election, Black History Month, both are good times to reflect on how far back the struggle for full citizenship reaches. And for a historian like myself, those parallels are instructive. Thank you, and we will go to Candace Kutungi.
It's not happenstance that this land of agrarian hope for Black New Yorkers was given an African name, because Black people have a long history of linking their African past to their quest for freedom and progress in America. For Black people in the early national and antebellum periods, Africa was their source of heritage, evidence of a glorious past, and a unifying symbol for Black people as they sought freedom and equality in the United States. There has been a long tradition of African heritage infused into Black political organizations, burial sites, secret societies, religious denominations, voluntary associations, schools, public meeting houses, and in the case of Timbuctoo, entire regions of land. There were many ways that Africa and African retentions appeared in these racial uplift projects, but one of the clearest and most profoundest expressions was in the ways these self-determined institutions, organizations, spaces, and liberation strategies bore Africa's name. By claiming their African past, Black people asserted that they had a history that far exceeded bondage in the Americas. Though in a separate and a removed land, they were asserting themselves as the sons and daughters of Africa in reverence to where they had come from and as a testament to where they saw their people going. Africa thus became integral to the ways in which African Americans made claims to the human dignity that that the institution of slavery and the gross injustice of racial inequality in the United States had attempted to stamp out of African Americans. More than a name then, Africa, and in this case, Timbuctoo, became a symbol of hope, pride, and the potential for racial progress. This was especially clear in the case of Black New Yorkers, who, by the end of the Revolution, were describing themselves and their institutions as African. Although there is scant information regarding the earliest Black organizations in the state of New York, we know that by 1792, New York City had created at least 2 organizations with Africa's name, the Free African Society and the African Institution, both of which were dedicated to improving the conditions of Black people. These African organizations reflected the self-determined agency that Black people relied on in their struggles against slavery, racism, and inequality. Perhaps the clearest way to understand this is to look at the ways in which antebellum Blacks, intellectuals of the time, talked about Africa in relation to Black freedom and racial progress. One of the most profoundest Black intellectuals of the antebellum era was a woman by the name of Mariah Stewart. She was a spiritual leader, an educator, and a radical abolitionist. She was born in Connecticut and is most known for her riveting yet controversial speeches delivered in Boston, Massachusetts between 1832 and 1833. She was the first American-born woman to speak before a mixed crowd of both men and women, an act at that time considered to be promiscuous. She did more than just speak. She was an awesome orator, a courageous activist, and she addressed the state of the Black nation and the political, social, and economic roots of racism in every one of her speeches. For Stewart, Black advancement was contingent on spirituality, education, and moral reform. And her solution was rooted in community, ancestral pride, and collective action. She wanted to break the chains of slavery and inequality, and African heritage was at the center of her mandate that people be, as she said, united as one. Indeed, it was their African ancestry that Stewart, as well as many of her contemporaries, argued was necessary for Black people to challenge racial oppression as they sought to create new realities for themselves in America. She saw Africa as a glorious land, calling attention to notions of the quote-unquote dark continent, but quickly dispelled that myth to reveal a liberation strategy that proudly held up the banner of Africa. Black people, as Stewart called it, were the sons and daughters of Africa, whose glorious ancestry had made them destined to overcome the injustice that they had been facing since they had first crossed the Atlantic. In 1833, speaking before a crowd of Black men at the African Masonic Hall in Boston, Massachusetts, another tribute to Africa, I might add, Stewart said, quote, "History informs us that we sprung from one of the most learned nations of the whole earth, from the seat, if not the parent, of science. Yes, poor despised Africa was once the resort of sages and legislators of other nations, was esteemed the school for learning, and the most illustrious men in Greece flocked hither for instruction." Her repeated references to Africa and African ancestry in her discussion of racial pride and progress demonstrates that she, like many Black intellectual activists at this time, challenged the Western depiction of Africa as dark and adopted a sense of pride and connection to this homeland. But Stewart's connection to Africa exceeded a romantic reverence for the past. It also symbolized a call to action. She once said, quote, "Ethiopia might stretch forth her hands unto God, but we have a great work to do. Never, no never will the chains of slavery and ignorance burst till we become united as one." For Stewart, the power of Africa was inspiring, but could only be harnessed if African Americans put forth the work themselves. The greatness of Africa that she saw was one of hope and promise, but also required the strength, commitment, and self-determination of Black people in the United States. And her understanding of Black people and their connection to Africa went even beyond race, as she used Africa to affirm the centrality of Black women in that struggle for freedom and progress. She said, "O ye daughters of Africa, awake, awake, arise. No longer sleep nor slumber, but distinguish yourselves. Show forth to the world that ye are endowed with noble and exalted faculties. She not only acknowledges the ancestral power within Black women, but uses this as a call to immortalize their names beyond the grave, to set examples for the rising generations to come. And with each calling, her invocation of Africa became the rationale for African American unity in the struggle against both white supremacy and gender oppression. How long shall the fair daughters of Africa be compelled to bury their minds and talents beneath a load of iron pots and kettles, she asked, until union, knowledge, and love begin to flow among us. Her call to women was radical, but it was indeed too much for many to handle. As a woman, and the first to walk down this promiscuous path, her conviction and clarity about Black people, the nation, freedom, and progress was not enough to dispel the gender roles that deemed her out of order. She had crossed the lines of respectability and was riddled with opposition, not for what she was saying, but because it was she who was saying it. The opposition was so deep that she chose to leave Boston for Williamsburg, New York in 1833. So it is certainly possible that Stewart may have known some of the many Black men who would settle the Adirondacks 10 years later. She, however, might argue that part of Timbuctoo's failings was because there were no women involved.
And rather than give a history of Timbuktu, its birth and death and all the, and its life and times, which is what this exhibit does, I think, fantastically, I'll let the exhibit speak for itself. And what I'd rather do is talk about Timbuktu in a cultural and sort of cultural and intellectual and environmental context. And I want to make the case that Timbuktu was on the front lines of a really quite radical social, cultural, and environmental project that sought to remake the entire U.S., not just the Adirondacks, not just New York, but the entire U.S. It wasn't just about slavery, although that was obviously a major part of the whole Timbuktu experiment. But it was also about racism, and I think perhaps more generally it was about human domination, right? It was a critique of one human dominating another, generally. Though Timbuktu has largely been forgotten, I think the biggest argument I want to make is that it's an example that we still very much need today. The second thing that I want to do is to tell you just a very quick short story, and Scott sort of got at it a little bit in the beginning. My first trip to the Adirondacks was on July 4th, 1996. I was 16. My best friend had organized a backpacking trip. And it was fantastic. Everything happened to us on this backpacking trip that happens on backpacking trips. We got eaten by black flies, soaked by thunderstorms. We got yelled at by a forest ranger. I fell into a river, and it was fabulous. It was an experience that literally changed my life. I've been going to the Adirondacks ever since. In fact, last year on a research trip to research in part Timbuktu, my wife and I took our then 3-month-old son up his first Adirondack mountain peak. And what I love about the Adirondacks, what keeps bringing me back, is that they're different. So I grew up in rural upstate New York, about 3 hours south of the Adirondacks. I went to college in Vermont, about an hour east of the Adirondacks, and now I'm in Ithaca, about 5 hours or so, a long 5 hours south of the Adirondacks. So for almost my entire life, they've been pretty close. And yet they just feel vastly different than any other place I've ever lived. History, too, I think, so there's something about the Adirondacks that feels wonderfully strange, right? And I think history, too, feels wonderfully strange to me. Historians we like to talk about how, we like to say that the past is a foreign country, right? And one of the things that I think we're getting at is that the past is wonderfully strange, right? We go to foreign countries to eat different food and feel different climates and see different people, and hopefully some of this difference sticks to us, right? And when we come home, we're different people than when we left. Some of that difference sticks. And this difference is one of the things that keeps me trudging uphill from downtown up to Cornell every day. to work on my history. I first got into Timbuctoo when I was 20. I read Russell Banks's historical novel Cloud Splitter about John Brown, and there's a big chunk of that pretty big book is set in the Adirondacks. And it was the first time that I realized that two of the things that I really loved, history and the Adirondacks, sort of overlapped, right? Not that there's not other history in the Adirondacks. I mean, there's all sorts of history, but something about it just really caught my imagination. So for the rest of the talk, I'd urge you to try to savor this wonderful strangeness, to wander around in this foreign country of the past, to breathe deeply of its air and to feel its earth under your feet. So to begin, just a few basic facts. So Gerrit Smith was a white abolitionist who lived in upstate New York near Ithaca, and he was one of New York State's richest men. He inherited nearly 1 million acres of land in New York State, much of it in the Adirondacks. He was a total reformer. He was devoted to the full suite of 19th century reforms. He was a teetotaler. He didn't drink at all. He was a religious reformer, and he had all sorts of very, very interesting ideas on religion. He was a land reformer, and he was a committed abolitionist. He was, my understanding is he was a pretty radical abolitionist. He wasn't one of the abolitionists who thought that African Americans should be sent back to Africa, but he was one of the abolitionists who felt that there should be free equality in the United States for everybody. In 1846, as you've heard, he decided to give 120,000 acres of land, most of it in the Adirondacks, away to 3,000 black families. Later on, around 1850 or so, he'll also give away land to 1,000 very poor white families. And this gets to his land reform. The land was somewhat scattered throughout the Adirondacks, and when some of the black settlers got to their holdings, many of them decided that instead of going to the remote plots of land and live by themselves, they'd set up two communities, these communities, Timbuctoo and Blacksville. And then the end of the story is that by, well, the end, we can talk about this a lot, but by the early 1850s or so, many people were starting to write this Adirondack experiment off as a failure, right? There was a turn to different projects involving more violence. So as I've been thinking about Timbuctoo over the past 12 years or so, there are two questions that always pop into my mind, and I think will be popping into my mind for as long as I'm thinking about Timbuctoo. The first is, why on earth anyone would decide that the Adirondacks were a great place for the cause of abolition, to take a stand against slavery. The Adirondacks are kind of out of the way now. They were really out of the way in 1846. People wrote of sinking up to their knees in mud on the main roads. There weren't many roads. It was tough to get there, and once you were there, it was tough to make a living in the Adirondacks. Right? If you're a farmer, the growing season is not particularly long. Logging is a tough job. And there's snow. On my first hike on the 4th of July, there was still snow on the ground. So why? And there are a number of potential answers. One of them might be political power. As Professor Washington suggested, in 1840, Gerrit Smith and others formed their own party, the political party. And some historians have said that Gerrit Smith, or suggested that Gerrit Smith gave land away to African Americans, and sort of in some ways to kind of buy a vote, right? That if 3,000 African American men got the land, could improve it to the point where it was worth $250, they'd vote for the guy that gave it to them. There's something to this. I don't necessarily think it's the most important part of the argument, but there's something to this. Another answer might be that the Adirondacks were, they were out there. They were a safe retreat. It was a safe route for a branch of the Underground Railroad. And I think there's something to this as well. But I think there's something else. I think there's another part of the answer that relates to the intellectual and cultural history of the U.S. And Smith wrote in 1846, when he was sort of announcing his land giveaway, he wrote, I am an agrarian. I would that every man who desires a farm might have one, and I would that no man were so regardless of the needs and desires of his brother men as to covet the possession of more farms than one. So on the surface, this is innocuous enough, right? It sounds like the standard Jeffersonian faith in the small yeoman farmer, right? That real Americans farm small plots. But a lot had changed from 1787 or so when Jefferson's writing about yeoman farmers. And one of the things that had changed is that by the 1840s, there's a war over agrarianism in the United States. And farming and agrarianism is starting to be seen as a Southern thing, right? John C. Calhoun, he was a politician from South Carolina, and he served in just about every political office you could possibly serve in. He was a senator and vice president and all sorts of other things. Calhoun wrote, "Every plantation is a little community. These small communities aggregated make the state in all, whose action, labor, and capital is equally represented and perfectly harmonized." And George Fitzhugh, a Virginia lawyer and social theorist, wrote, "In Boston, 9/10 of the men in business fail. In the slave-holding South, except in new settlements, failures are extremely rare. Small properties descend from generation to generation in the same family. There is as much stability and permanence of property as is compatible with energy and activity in society. Fortunes are made rather by virtuous industry than by tricks, cunning, and speculation." Right? A lot of Southerners are making the arguments that the plantation economy, that agrarian farming equals stability, social harmony, and ironically, equality. Right? So when Gerrit Smith says that he's an agrarian, that he's going to start this experiment, he's fighting back against an intellectual tradition that's taking hold in the South and taking hold rather strongly. As Frederick Douglass put it, and Frederick Douglass was given a plot of land in the Adirondacks. Frederick Douglass wrote in his paper, "Come, brethren, let it not be said that a people who, under the lash, could level the forests of Virginia, Maryland, and the whole southern states, that their oppressors might reap the reward, lack the energy and manly ambition to clear lands for themselves." Right? They're going to take back the land. They're going to take back farming and agrarianism. But there's something else going on. I'll come back to the agrarian thing in a little bit. There's something else going on, and it's the science of race, the developing science of race. For at least 100 years, white Americans had been trying to figure out where race came from and why white folks were better than everybody else. In a lot of ways, this goes back to Jefferson again. And in 1787, in the notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote, "Whether the black of the Negro's skin resides in the reticular membrane between the skin and scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from that of some other secretion, the difference is fixed in nature, and is as real as if its seat and cause were better known to us." This is remarkable, right? It's Jefferson, who's incredibly smart, saying he doesn't know why black people are inferior. They just are, right? He just has this faith that they're scientifically inferior. In 1846, the same year that Smith starts giving away his lands, the science of race gets a big boost when a Swiss scientist named Louis Agassiz moves to the U.S. He gets hired at Harvard, and he's literally a rock star. He would give lectures to halls, a 500-person hall, standing room only. He would give them in French, and they were so popular, there were so many people lined up outside who couldn't get in that he'd have to repeat the lecture again and again and again. He's the imagine Carl Sagan and Mick Jagger sort of combined. When Louis Agassiz gets to the United States, he discovers the American science of race, which allows him to tie together three threads that he'd been struggling to connect: the authority of the Bible with the authority of science and the authority of white supremacy. And this gets complicated. I'll try to keep it not super complicated. But in short, what he comes up with is a theory where each race is a distinct species, right? Blacks and whites are as different as cats and dogs, essentially. And each race is created by an individual act of God, right? On Saturday at 2 p.m., God created white people. At 2:30, created black people, so on and so on. And furthermore, he argues that each race has a specific ecological niche, right? That that black people belong in the South where it's hot, and white people belong in the North where it's much cooler. So when Gerrit Smith and when the settlers moved to Timbuktu, they're taking on this. They're taking on one of the strongest intellectual and political and cultural traditions in the United States, and they know it, right? They're sort of knowingly wading into a tsunami, and they make a pretty good go of it, right? Only about 10% of the lands, the families ever claimed their land, but they made a pretty good go of it. By the late 1850s, or by the early to mid 1850s, it seems like Timbuktu is starting to fail, and there are a number of reasons that people have adduced for this failure. Some of which you'll see on in the exhibition. But I think I want to question the idea that it actually failed, right? A number of the Theodore Wright, Charles B. Ray, and James McCune Smith, who are some of the prime black movers behind Timbuktu, said it. There is no life like that of the farmer for overcoming the mere prejudice against color. The owners of adjacent farms are neighbors. There must be mutual assistance, mutual and equal dependence, mutual sympathy and labor. The common destiny of the American people under such circumstances yield equally to all and makes all equal. Hence, a number starting out together for the same neighborhood may by mutual aid affect a great deal in meeting with and overcoming the first and severest difficulties. There's a real emphasis on community, on mutual aid, right? They're articulating what we might call now a sort of ecology of freedom, an ecology of liberty. And I actually think that this is the weakness of Timbuktu, that they were a little bit, in the same way that you were talking about Mariah Stewart, that they were a little bit too radical for their time, right? They were talking about overcoming oppression by joining hands with everybody, right? That something about farming the harsh landscape of the Adirondacks itself was going to destroy slavery and racism. We could say that it's utopian that only the violence of the Civil War ultimately destroyed slavery. But I think that we need this utopian thinking, right? Their emphasis on community ties into what Professor Washington was talking about earlier about Martin Luther King's book, Chaos versus Community, right? Timbuktu is articulating a notion of community that we still very much need today. So in conclusion, I just want to say two things. I think today we need Timbuktu as much as we ever did. We need to wander around in the strangeness of the past and let some of it stick to us, to change us. We've got a president who urged upon us the audacity of hope, and there are few things that are as audaciously hopeful as I think the Timbuktu experiment, right? And by way of closing, I just want to read the words of John Thomas, a runaway slave who had a plot of land up in the Adirondacks and moved to the Adirondacks. And he wrote to Smith and said, "By labor and economy, my farm has been enlarged into a handsome farm of 200 acres with all necessary stock and farming implements. I generally have a surplus of $200 or $300 worth of farm produce to sell every year. I have breasted the storm of prejudice and opposition, and I begin to be regarded as an American citizen."
I'll be telling you two stories. One will be a visual story that you'll see up front, and one will be the visual story in which you hear that I read to you. And so my remarks are tangentially connected to Timbuktu, and much more about the importance of history and of knowing history in particular. One by one, they would emerge from the local archives. Single black and brown faces mixed amongst the seas of whiteness. Class photos, yearbook entries, black-owned newspapers, personal diaries, and more. Local historians had warned these stories could not be found. Some stated, quote, "The South Side does not readily come to mind when phrases such as historically significant or architecturally important are used," end quote. Others stated that, quote, "Finding information about blacks in the earliest days of Tompkins County is not easy, since material about them was not collected into area archives," end quote. Or, quote, "that a rich life that black Ithacans created for themselves was apart from the white community and for the most part unremarked by them." And yet, there we were, one by one, two by two, church group by community picnic. To be certain, the previous quotes are not properly contextualized. In fact, I borrow heavily from local historians and each of the quotes has been purposely plucked from more substantial conversations about Ithaca's times and its black past. Earlier historians were not necessarily looking for black folks as their primary objects, or more importantly, as subjects on our own terms. Their collective work forms the foundation of my ongoing exploration, and this is an exploration that's partially formed by the irony and tension of being conspicuously unseen. With the exception of a single image, all the archival photos that you see are gleaned from the history collections right here in this building. I am especially indebted to the assistance and expertise of Donna Eschenbrenner. Mrs. Eschenbrenner, who along with Mary Williams, Carl Koski, and Natalie King suggested collections, captured high-quality scans of originals, provided bibliographic information, and more. In many respects, my job was the easiest. And if we could, I just have to give those folks a round of applause. They do phenomenal work. By way of a quick tangent, it was about a year ago that I decided that I was going to not be a middle-aged man and get myself back in basketball shape. And on day one, I tore my Achilles, which put me literally in a cast and not walking for a couple months. And so the way in which I spent that time was here at the History Center, literally having folks hand feed me boxes, photo books, you name it. And so I spent a couple days, if not a couple weeks, just going through photo after photo. And so what you see here is the result of that process of me gleaning some photos from these archives here. From the hundreds, if not thousands of images, there are 35 images presented here. These 35 are chosen for their common representation as well as for their specificity. In other words, the images presented here were chosen because they offer a generic representation of my time in the archives. There is no shortage of similar images. However, this narrative and these images were also chosen because they tell of a specific location, a local history, including the names that adorn local landmarks, iconic and regional scenery, as well as events of local importance. Ithaca, New York is a small city in upstate New York. Officially, the U.S. Office of Management and Business refers to the city proper as, quote, a micropolitan statistical area. It is, as the micropolitan label implies, a small community, but one that is surprisingly diverse, highly educated, over-caffeinated, fairly cosmopolitan, and consistently politically active. It is the prototype of a university or a college town, and as we know, Ithaca is home to both. Ithaca also has a historic black population. There are autobiographies about enslavement and emancipation. The St. James AME Zion Church is listed on our National Registry of the Underground Railroad and has celebrated over 175 years of existence. The Southside Community Center was dedicated by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Add the birthplace of Alex Haley, lecture stops for Frederick Douglass, familial connections of Harriet Tubman, the origins of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, home of the Africana Studies and Research Center, and Ithaca has a place in Black American historiography as well as geography. My original quest to delve into the area archives begins with my dissertation research. As Dr. James Turner instructs, quote, one of the 4 basic tasks of the Africana scholar is to preserve the acknowledged value of rare classical texts in the field, including archival and library collections. My dissertation research utilized archival research in an attempt to construct a counter-narrative on educational experiences of Black students in this community. Throughout our recorded history, Black folks have a well-documented connection between education and freedom. And I knew that Black folks had been in Ithaca as early as 1788, a full century before Ithaca Incorporated would even come into existence. What were the narratives of our students? There is no doubt that the preponderance of school and school-related images are a result of my educational policy bias. However, the overrepresentation also speaks to the prevalence of archival material related to schools and education. I could not see Black and brown faces all the time, but when I did, the photographs were frequently associated with schooling, class photos, club photos, athletic banquets, choral concerts, yearbooks, etc. Schools were, and schools remain, the main social enterprise of any community. Schools are the place where families send their most prized possessions. These significant institutions, usually crossing wide swaths of geography, ideology, and experience, offer some insight into local communities, and probably more importantly, into the lives of people who live there. Therefore, the purpose of this project was twofold. In returning to the archives, my first purpose was to spend some time reading the photographs. Photographs can speak, and the ones that are presented here are the ones that spoke to me. So my intent was to visually read the photographs, to study the archival images, to allow the eye time to scan for subtlety, and to test the colloquial equation that a picture is worth 1,000 words. The second purpose is to retell a part of the Black diasporic experience. I believe all history is a retelling. What researchers and academics study as history has already been lived and experienced. In other words, it has already been known. Historians do not discover. Historians retell. Historians recall stories of life, usually only after the living have passed. When I read the photographs, part of the narrative reminds me that presence does not equate to visibility. It is possible to be conspicuously unseen, visible yet ignored. W.E.B. Du Bois famously talks of double consciousness, quote, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, and of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, end quote. This is the experience of being conspicuously unseen. Inconspicuously seen might have even been preferable, but to be so obviously unseen, that becomes a source of anger. And to be certain, it was anger that drove me back into the archives, to arm myself with the knowledge of and from before, to know something about the before. I was captivated by the images I found. One by one, the photographs became especially noteworthy because of their oneness. There was a frequency of the apparent solitude and singleness. There were classes of 20 or more looking at the camera, and suddenly only one student was looking back at me. My time in the archives made me consider the singular Black experience. What part of the singular experience helps to construct the collective? If one is always a member of what Malawi Karenga has termed, quote, a person in community, what do we learn from the existence of isolation? This visual reading pushed me to consider the experience of, quote, being a fly in the bowl of milk. It made me consider the directness of the question posed by Du Bois, how does it feel to be a problem? And I should say that that quote about a fly in the bowl of milk comes from my uncle, Ashfield Buster DeVent, who in Bermuda during Bermudian integration walked past a newspaper showed a single Black face in the seas of whiteness and overheard a white man pass by saying, a fly in the bowl of milk. Possible answers are difficult to infer, but through the archival photographs alone. However, photographs of a 1925 Ku Klux Klan rally in Ithaca, or Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1961 speech on behalf of Ithaca Freedom Walk, give some indication of the racial life and strife in Ithaca. As one local historian remarked, quote, although Ithaca has a cherished reputation for racial tolerance that predates the Civil War, the experience of its Black community did not differ greatly from those Blacks almost anywhere in the nation. And like anywhere USA, there's a combination of suffering and success. Through a broader analysis, my reading of the collection of archives adds to the complexity and nuance of the diasporic Black experience. In other words, the diasporic experience is generally lived locally. To be certain, there is regional exchange. Ideas, culture, and families are shared transnationally, but the day-to-day living is a localized experience. The diasporic experience is shaped by the particular places and specific spaces we inhabit daily. It is influenced by the monotony and the minutiae of local routines. Researching specific communities provides the level of detail and nuance necessary for more widely shared generalizations. It provides the complexity required to fully address the totality of the daily diasporic experience. What are the stories of these students? What are the stories of their families? What are the shared narratives we have about their singularly collective experience? The brilliance of still photography lies in its ability to capture moments. It is a technological innovation that allows us to literally frame slices of time. And yet the danger of still photography is the converse proposition. Photographs have a tendency to freeze the living, to simplify the moment, to remove the context, and to eliminate the preceding seconds, hours, or weeks. This is particularly true with black and white images. Devoid of color, black and white photographs remove the vibrancy of living and hearken to a time before high-definition 3D televisions, let alone mass mobile cameras. In this way, these photographs offer a sense of distance by making an explicit and implicit reference to an era of bygone technology. To further this sense of distancing, many of the photographs are captured at a physical distance. In other words, the camera is located some distance from the subjects. They are not close-ups, they are group shots, they are class photos, and by their nature, they are deliberate, purposeful, planned, and impersonal. The possibility of double distancing by way of technology and camera location presents the readers with an incomplete history. I'd like to also present or suggest there may be a triple distancing, and that at times there is a physical distance between the singular black student and their white classmates. This may be more speculation currently than visual evidence may provide. but we will do more to read and write life into these photographs. And yet, despite the initial suggestion or warning or recommendation that absence we would be in the archives, here we are, visible to those who seek. The sage African proverb, I am because we are, and because we are, therefore I am, gets replayed and remixed. We are because we were, and black folks were in Ithaca. How could our lives possibly escape collection to the archives? We were here. We are here. We Are Here is not an attempt to recapture a Booker T. Washingtonian version of cast down your buckets of where you are. It's not an attempt to lay claim to a land that rightfully belongs to the Kutungi Nation and the Haudenosaunee people. We are here as a matter of existence. It is a matter of being while becoming. It is a matter of fact. And as such, and even though, quote, the black community forged ahead on its own, end quote, we can still be found in the archives. The history may be more difficult to research, rediscover, and retell, but it is there if we shift our lens, or dare I say, if we shift our audience. After a class discussion about the arguments of the Trinidadian scholar Eric Williams and his ideas of the interconnectedness of capitalism, inhumanity, and racial chattel slavery, a student stopped me and asked the following in exasperation: Professor, what am I supposed to do with this information for the rest of my day? It was a jarring question. All jobs, academia included, have a rhythm. The daily cadence of teaching, email, committees, and teaching becomes repetitive. But this question stopped me and gave me pause. What am I supposed to do with this information for the rest of my day? Quickly gathering myself, I could not answer the question for the student. I could only tell the student how I use this information, including archival imagery, to go about my days. What do the counter-narratives tell me? My first response is to quote the comedian Chris Rock. Upon hearing that his grandfather was a Civil War veteran and a South Carolina state senator, Chris Rock was asked his thoughts about the significance of learning his family's history. Rock responds, quote, what does it mean? It would have removed the inevitability that I would become nothing. More importantly than the possibility of nothingness, knowing my history and recouping our collective past provides something much more tangible and concrete, a path toward liberation. The photographs offer examples of existence and possibilities. Knowing counter-narratives is one of the key most essential freedom and emancipatory skills, far beyond the reach of politics, policy, or legislation. It is the insuredness and the salvation of struggle. In the end and in the faces, I see a resiliency and courage. I see a stoic determination and a quiet resolution. For many, even in the eyes of shyness, the expression is one of resolve. I see bravery in being the only one, or one of the only few. I see the same resolve in the photographs of family gatherings or of church congregations. I see a sense of valor in the faces of people. The point here is not to overstate the importance. Photographs are only one of the ways in which we retell our stories. However, throughout the shared history, photographs become iconic and etched into the collective memory of a generation and a nation. Many times, photographs represent ideology and deeply held feelings. The sight does the speaking. The symposium title, Conspicuously Unseen: Invisibility and Denial in Diasporic Communities, made me consider the role of audience. Conspicuous or otherwise, unseen by whom? Unseen by all? I began to wonder how much of the black diasporic experience is about its supposed relationship and interaction with whiteness. It takes work to develop a lens that can only selectively see. History is not only about what we uncover and discover. History is much more about what we choose to recover. More research, including genealogy research, is needed to gain a better understanding of these singular collective experiences in photographs. Still, and similar to Dr. Carol Boyce Davies' proclamation about the importance of literature, archival research and archival photographs can be used to, quote, give shape to who we are, to document our existence, and to make sense of our experience and to write ourselves into history.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all the panelists for excellent presentations. I just want to say an addendum. When Frederick Douglass came to Ithaca, he wrote to his Rochester friend, he was living in Rochester at the time, that he was considering moving to Ithaca because the schools were integrated. And his daughter was not allowed to go to the public schools in Rochester. But African Americans in Ithaca, this is in the 1850s, could go to school. And so I thought that was, it's in a letter that he wrote, I think it's 1852, 53. Okay, comments, questions? If we can't answer them, maybe somebody in the audience can.
People will here agree with me, but I look at capitalism as an amoral entity. And in the New World, if you had an investment and you wanted to make money on it, you needed labor. And somehow they couldn't come up with a system to pay a fair wage to laborers, so they were somehow established a brutal but successful slavery regime that made it work.
Yeah, the reference for me of Eric Williams, who wrote a book, Slavery and Capitalism, and one of his famed quotes is that slavery is exclusively economic, and therefore the racism that follows is to justify the economic exploitation. I would just challenge two quick points, and I'm sure other folks have more comments. I don't think we needed a labor system. I think we wanted a labor system, right? In other words, there was choice. You don't have to enslave folks. We could have found a different way of doing it, and I think as we find that once we felt slavery became economically inefficient, we start making far more substantial moral arguments about its decline. There's no doubt that there are significant numbers of folks, white folks most specifically, who are making moral arguments and fighting for the eradication of slavery. But for the vast American public, I would dare make the argument that when it became economically expedient is when slavery ends en masse. And Williams captures this. And for my students, when I teach this, it's revolutionary because they think slavery is about racism, as if somehow white folks didn't like black folks, which is laughable to me. No, it's about greed and money, right? And if I can maximize, I think as Gerrit Smith said, right, why do I need more than one farm, right? One farm should be all I need. And so that's one of, a lot of people debunk Williams's work, but it's a book that I think everyone should read at some point in time if you're interested in slavery studies.
We often read about escaped slaves traveling through Ithaca, being helped by the Underground Railroad, until they reached Canada and freedom. And what happened to them when they were in Canada? No one ever tells me.
Canada had race problems. It's important to realize that Canada was part of the British Empire, and Britain abolished slavery in 1832. And even after they abolished slavery, Canada still had slavery. So there were some racial problems, but the point was that once slavery was abolished in the British Empire, once you got there from the United States, you were free, whatever your condition was. And their conditions were, you know, pretty bad in some cases. And again, they did the same thing that the Timbuctoo people did. They didn't settle on all of those 40 acres. They created a community. They created settlements. And so that's what African Americans did in Canada West. They created Chatham and Windsor and their own little communities for communalism, because that was, you know, it was culturally where they were. But you know, Canada was not a haven from racism, but it was a haven from slavery after 1832.
A good number of folks also didn't make the full journey. So Penn Yan, New York, Geneva, New York, Ithaca, New York, Elmira, New York, right? So once folks made north, Canada was no longer the option or the goal, staying here as well, right? And that's why there's been a black church in Ithaca for almost 185 years.
Yeah, many of them did not go farther than Michigan, New York. After 1850, when the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law, they did. Because there were many African Americans living in the North who were self-emancipated, and whole communities disappeared after 1850. So at one point, in 1 month, 15,000 African Americans left the United States after the Fugitive Slave Law was passed. So that made a difference. But yes, the majority of African Americans, once they got past the Mason-Dixon line, opted to stay in the United States. And that's why the Fugitive Slave Law was so successful, because they were uprooting people who, some of whom had been living free for 15, 20 years. Some wives didn't even know that their husbands had been born in slavery. It was a very wrenching situation. I have a question, Amy. Do you know if there was a school in the settlement in Timbuctoo?
But it wasn't just for Timbuctoo, it was for all people in the community of North Elba, of which Timbuctoo is an enclave of about 3 or 4 families. It's not a name that is given to the whole region. It just refers to that tiny enclave, and it only crops up in 3 letters. One from a black grantee, and one from John Brown, and one from his son. Maybe 2 from John Brown and 2 from his son. It's not on any map. The agents never named Timbuctoo. Gerrit Smith never names Timbuctoo. So the origin of the name is a little unclear. Some historians have assumed it was a racist slur on the community given to it by locals who thought it was demeaning to call it Timbuctoo. But as you rightly say, in the black press, Timbuctoo was a name of pride. And that's what local historians have missed in the story that you described so beautifully. But it isn't on a map, and it's interesting that the promoters of the effort don't use the name Timbuctoo when they're talking about it.
Could one of the panelists speak to the reaction of the residents of that area to this influx of African Americans?
From looking at the panels and some of the letters from some of the agents, while they did have some support, the reaction was not positive. Now you can correct me on that, but from some of the letters, for example, from Jermaine Logan and other people who are telling the settlers to be very, very careful, and because most of them cannot read and write, that because there are these efforts to tamper with the tax laws and things like that, that they really need to be careful in terms of who they talk to, and they actually mention certain whites whom it's okay to talk to. And so that seems to me to give the impression that the reception is not positive for these settlers.
I think it's quite mixed. There are some families that welcome the settlers who need community builders badly to help them develop their communities. Others are cheaters, the post office guy, the merchant who fleeces the grantees. So Logan does give the names of 8 nice white guys in the Adirondacks who they could trust in Franklin and Essex. But the dealings of the grantees on the ground suggest there was more support than that. It was quite mixed. Even the accounts of this cheating surveyor are hard to read because he described himself as a serious abolitionist who would like to see Gerrit Smith in the White House, and he felt completely misunderstood by this whole episode. So it's a hard one to call. But yeah, Logan's testament, completely accurate or not, I think had a very dampening effect on the impulse to immigrate from the cities.
And the surveyor is interesting, right? He's got a lot of ads in Frederick Douglass's newspaper, and he gets some testaments that this is an honest Adirondack surveyor who's going to show you to your plot, and you're actually going to get the full 40 acres instead of 35 or something less. But then a controversy develops with the surveyor. And this is one of the reasons John Brown, one of the reasons I think John Brown heads out is that one of the things he is a surveyor, and he's going to help ensure an honest. People are going to actually get the land that they're deeded.
You mentioned something about the Civil War and slavery. My contention is that without the Civil War, we'd probably still have slavery because of the property rights. And it took the war to end it. It wasn't, I was in college too, they talked about the fact it was going to, end because of economics. But down south, they developed a very successful slave system that worked. It worked for them. And without the Civil War, I just don't see slavery ending.
The counterfactual question, right? If we didn't have a John Brown, or we didn't have an Abraham Lincoln, or we didn't, Gettysburg didn't go the way that it went, or whatever. So I wasn't trying to suggest that the wrong thing happened, but I think with the Timbuctoo colony, there's this moment where there's this very radical social critique that gets lost. I think, right? I think when most of the radical abolitionists turn away from critiquing violence itself as wrong, they gain a certain traction, right? It's violence freed the slaves much more quickly than everybody joining hands in farming, would have, if it ever would have. But something is lost as well, right? And I think what gets lost is this broad spectrum social critique that we still very much need today, right? And coming out of an environmental background, it's only within the past 15 years or so that social justice and environmentalism have started to blend in with each other, right? The traditional view of environmentalism is that it's like a bunch of upper middle class white guys who like to go skiing, right? And they're gonna save this park or whatever to, to recreate, to have fun in. But in about the mid-90s or so, maybe a little earlier, social justice and environmental activism and environmental justice started to come together and find out that there was actually a lot in common, right? They're starting to rediscover some of the critiques that I think McCune Smith and Jermaine Wesley Logan and a number of these other folks were articulating in the mid-1840s. But it took 150 years to rediscover that I think very trenchant, useful critique.
Yes, sir, do you have a question?
Going a little more forward in time, after the Civil War and into the 1900s, the predominantly black towns and enclaves that we know about are the ones, or at least that are remembered anyway, the ones that where something violent happened. And places like Timbuctoo and Blacksville, we don't. Do you have the sense that there are other places like that scattered around the Northeast, the upper Midwest?
And during this era, which was the era of utopianism, and there were lots of utopian communities, but I honestly don't know of any that were actually black. I do know of some that were integrated, and they usually were sort of abolitionist headquarters. But I don't know of any utopia, and I studied utopianism because Sojourner Truth was a utopianist. But I don't know of any other settlements. And if somebody else does, I'd be interested in knowing about it. Until after the Civil War.
Yeah.
And then you get a lot of them.
It's a very rare situation.
I think it's also interesting that that they wanted to settle together, even though Smith had given them Smith's idea and their ideas were different. I mean, their attitude was, let's congregate, let's be together. And his was, these little plots of land. And they had a different, because for them it was, citizenship was important, but so was communalism.
Absolutely.
And so in that sense, it was part of this concept of utopian and communitarianism that was really sweeping the nation in the 1840s.
Why were the children left enslaved in 1826, I believe you said?
Why were the children left in slavery?
Yeah.
Quite simply, they wanted the labor. This was not compensated slavery, compensated abolition, rather. It was straight up abolition. And so the adults were going to be free, and the owners were not going to get any compensation from the state. And the compensation was that they had the children.
Was that some kind of a political compromise?
It was part of gradual emancipation. And yes, it was a compromise. New York had been trying, people in not New York, but groups in New York, African Americans, the Methodists, the Quakers, some of the Federalists, had been trying to get an abolition bill through since the end of the Revolution. And they finally did when Tompkins was outgoing governor in 1817, and this was the compromise, was that the children would remain in bondage until 21, female, 25, if male, so they'd have their labor.
So it wasn't throughout their entire life when they reached...
No, it was only when they reached adulthood, then they got their freedom. I think the last person that actually was enslaved in the state of New York, I think it was something like 1848, 1850.
My limited reading of some of this research said they did pretty clear calculations to maximize the age at which labor would peak. And once they calculated, that's why it was 21 for women and 25 for men. After the peak of your labor years, you were set free. So I've already milked you for what I could. And if I'm not mistaken, at one point in my research, I think it was nearing 40 or 45 years old. I could be wrong about that, but that's what I recall researching when that law went into effect.
But in the South, if you were 5 years old, you were a quarter hand. So, and if you were 10, you were a half hand. So they were still getting labor out of these kids.
So I would love if you guys could to discuss the economic significance of someone before the end of the Civil War trying the 40 acres in view experiment, and what the possible implications of success of a venture like this could have meant for the entire nation.
To me, it's difficult to talk about the economic significance given the region, given the fact that they were in the Adirondacks, and you think about the arability of the land. How successful could you be up there? How successful were the farmers up there, the white farmers? How long is the growing season where you can actually cultivate crops up there? So I don't know how you would measure that unless, you know, if they were in, you know, the Long Island region, maybe, but maybe, yeah, Amy.
The black farmers who made it accommodate to the local economy, and they diversify their sources of income. So they don't just farm, they also guide, they trap, they log, they work in the emerging resort industry up there that starts booming after the Civil War. And to the extent that they do that, they succeed. To the extent that they try to live completely on subsistence farming, like every Adirondack farmer, they can't make it because the growing season is the shortest in the Northeast. It's miserable. But you can do it if you mix it up, and that's the genius of Adirondack life then and now. You don't diversify your song. So the ones who adopted the Adirondack lifestyle held on. And I think their attrition rate was no more or less than those of that of their white neighbors who fled Adirondack farms for points west at the same high rate as the grantee settlers who moved up there.
Was there a means for them acquiring that kind of knowledge to know that, because these were city dwellers, how would they know about diversification?
Well, most of the grantees who move up there and stay don't come from New York City. They come from Troy or smaller cities or even towns. Most of the people who get land from Gerrit Smith are from New York City. But we're talking about the people who actually move. And they probably come with a little fund of farm knowledge in their background that they could bring to bear on their new experimental gift land, as it's called.
So that booklet that we have here, I think it's over there, there are, we counted it last night, there are, I think, 28 pages of grantees from New York City.
At least.
And so you're saying that of those 20, and there's like, well, the booklet says 12 from Tompkins County, but in the list that Carol Kamen made up, there looks like there are 18. You compare that, and they don't, that's not even half a page. So you compare that with the New York City people, and so you're saying that most of those people did not even come to that land.
Censuses occur every 5 years, so what happens in between those brackets is unknowable. But most of the people who stay enough to reckon on a census aren't from New York City. They're from Albany, they're from Saratoga, they're from Troy, they're from Watertown, they're from Utica, they're from little towns. And many of them as well, we know about our fellow travelers. They're not grantees at all. The people who come with Willis Hodges' party, half of them aren't grantees. They're coming because they want to participate in this experiment. Whether they own land or have got a deed from Gerrit Smith or not, it doesn't matter. Then there are people who solicit land from him, who want to buy it to participate in this. So there are all kinds of types of participation in this experiment that don't comport with what his intention was. They take their own, the black community takes its own control of it at a certain point and remakes it in terms of its own needs. You don't get a deed, it doesn't necessarily matter. You can still go out there and try it. But New York City, that's a long way to take a chance. If you're from Troy and it doesn't work out, it's a lot easier to go back home.
Can I offer a quick response to part of the conversation that Mr. Harris and I have is about the value of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and more important, the intent. And he tries to make the argument that it was a legitimate effort to try to reorganize the United States, and I make the argument that it was the continuation of racist ideology. And the rationale behind this, for me, the best example of that is the 13th Amendment, which never actually abolishes slavery. And someone can look it up. I think the quote says something like, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude be allowed shall be permitted in these lands, except for a condition of which you've been of a crime for which you've been duly convicted." Right. So, in other words, to this day, 2012, our Constitution says that you can be enslaved if you've been convicted of a crime. Right. That's not 30 years ago or 80 years ago. That's what the 13th Amendment says to this day. And so that's my argument back and forth about whether that was actually the true intent to really revolutionize America and actually give black folks some sense of freedom, or let black folks earn and win their freedom.
You mentioned that slavery was exclusively economic, which I would guess means you feel that it wasn't discriminatory, it was just an economic. And again, going back to the comment that you made about whatever politician it was who said, "We'll elect anyone who's not alone." And I think
That's a quote.
yes. So I just wanted to ask you if you feel that those attempts to block certain votes have to do with discrimination and oppression, or if it is solely economic, relating back to that comment.
Yeah, and for me, race is class. They're one and the same. Race is an economic tool. The example I usually give is, say, we have a term for poor white folks in this country that we call white trash, because real white folks are middle class, right? So the way in which race and economics play itself out. The quote that you heard me say was, that's Eric Williams' thesis, that slavery is strictly economic. Of course, there are multiple components of it, and a couple of us mentioned the notion of violence. I think we oftentimes underestimate the way that slavery and Jim Crow were perpetuated almost exclusively through grotesque acts of violence. That's the only way in which you can oppress people oftentimes. And so the question about the Civil War, just to get back to that briefly, is I'm not sure what would have happened. I'm sure that black folks would have continued to fight and resurrect. So there's no guarantee that without the Civil War that we'd still be enslaved. I think black folks would have continued to fight and other folks would have joined in. In terms of what that means today, I think the example you gave almost proves Williams' thesis. If you're talking about the ability to take votes away primarily, almost exclusively from Central and South American folk, if we think that's somehow not related to our labor market, we think it's somehow not related to the push and pull of labor, and the ability for me to disenfranchise you politically to make sure I can continue to exploit you economically, I see that as being one and the same. And so I think Williams' thesis to some respect still holds true. Not that it's the end-all to be-all, and the reason why racism exists from my perspective is the ability for folks to have a moral justification to enact those acts of violence. How do you do so and sleep at night? Right? So you create systems that talk about moral supremacy to help you sleep at night about the violence that you create to make sure I have economic exploitation. So for me, racism is about the economics, not vice versa.
I think there's something to be said for cultural chauvinism, cultural supremacy, and you know, I have to go back to before slavery and contact with Africa on the part of, especially on the part of Northern Europeans, especially on the part of people from Britain, and their reaction to Africans when they first saw them. And I'm thinking in particular of this one trader named Jobson, who, this is like in the 1400s, and he and his men landed in what was the Upper Guinea, which is now the Gambia, and he was offered slaves by the Africans, and he said, no, we don't believe in enslaving people. At the same time, he had very scathing things to say about the culture of the people. That the women were promiscuous. Why were they promiscuous? Because they didn't cover their breasts. Which in their society, women didn't. They covered themselves from the waist down. But they didn't have the same concept of the sexual meaning of breasts that Europeans did. So his attitude is they were promiscuous. And he made other comments about them being heathens and all kinds of comments that suggested inferiority in regard to their cultural practices. At the same time, he didn't need any slaves because slavery had not developed in Great Britain at that time, or in the British colonies. So my point is that I think there's something else operating besides economics. And it's almost like a chicken-egg argument because we know that the whole concept of difference changed drastically when the economic need, quote, need in quotes, developed for labor. And after many thousands of Indians had been killed either by violence or disease, then Europeans went to the Africans. So certainly the economic argument is there, but you know, you really, I think, really have to give a lot of consideration to the whole concept of the other and how we view people who are different from us.
One way to see the exhibit in terms of the racism you're describing is as the specifically anti-racist initiative this was. Well, Gerrit Smith is renowned as an anti-slavery reformer. This was an anti-racist initiative. The anti-slavery part would come when the grantee settlers got the right to vote and they could vote the anti-slavery ticket. But the first impulse was to get the franchise into the hands of black New Yorkers who'd been deprived of it for 25 years. In this respect, it was really fresh and radical, especially for a white abolitionist when most of his peers were specifically concerned with slavery alone and not looking at its roots in racism, northern and southern. He desectionalizes it with this initiative and says, it's a problem up here, people. It's a problem in New York State. And this is an ingenious solution. Whether or not it worked, it's as you say, it's a kind of template for a fresh way of looking at a very old problem and coming up with a new solution. So I'd love us to think of it that way.
We have time for one more question.
What do you panelists think we can learn from this community that's on display today?
There are lots of reasons that I thought it would be good to bring it here, and I tried to touch on some of them in my remarks. One was the importance of citizenship and the fact that historically claiming citizenship has been an issue and that it continues to be an issue, and that it's important not to see it as something that happened back then, but that it's an issue that one has to be, as we have to be with a lot of issues, have to be ever vigilant about. Because we would not have needed a Voting Rights Act of 1965 if the 15th Amendment had not been virtually nullified by the states. We didn't really need that act. We needed it because the states had created laws that basically made the 15th Amendment null and void. And I see that process happening now as well. And so that was a very important reason for me. And the other reason was I felt that historically this is a very important moment for anti-slavery and for biracial cooperation in American history. And I think that was, it's a testament to the kinds of accomplishments that people can make when they work together. And I agree with Daegan that I really don't see it as a failure. You know, I think that a lot came out of it. Some people would disagree with me in terms of the significance of John Brown, but I think that it represented a very important moment in American history when progressive blacks and whites were working together.
For me, as someone who studies African American history but was unaware of Timbuctoo until quite recently, it just goes into one of the ways that I see myself as a student and scholar is to be committed to knowing the history that I should have already known. And also, I think it's important to really look at why we don't know certain things. And I think even the discussion of the name of Timbuctoo which, you know, my presentation was about placing that in the history of the way African Americans in this time were viewing Africa, and particularly activists and intellectual activists. But it's quite significant, and I was really interested to hear in the audience from the curator that there wasn't really mentionings of Timbuktu, and the way we even look at history, if it wasn't recorded in a certain way, it oftentimes doesn't exist for us. And I think it's our duty to look deep within, which is why I even brought up the issue of women, because we weren't going to talk about women with regards to this. And so I just think it's a commitment to knowing and learning what it is that we should have already known.
By the way, I read someplace that Gerrit Smith gave women $51 each.
I guess for me, I would say, I would just repeat the words of the Black abolitionists, Theodore Wright, Charles B. Ray, and James McCune Smith, who were, you know, along with Gerrit Smith, were some of the big movers and shakers behind this. And I wouldn't necessarily emphasize farming the way that they do, but I would repeat their words where they say, the owners of adjacent farms are neighbors. There must be mutual assistance, mutual and equal dependence, mutual sympathy, and labor, the common destiny of the American people under such circumstances, yields equally to all and makes all equal. Hence a number starting out together for the same neighborhood may by mutual aid affect a great deal in meeting with and overcoming the first and severest difficulties.
Dr. Washington touched upon this in her opening remarks. One of the things that I take away, and I struggle with in my own teaching around issues of race and oppression, is that the majority of white students who feel as if whenever time we have these conversations, it's about notions of guilt or of pain, and always a lack of pride. And so it's fascinating to me how we never learn, similar to what Candace says, about the amazing stories of interracial collaboration. As if somehow teaching us those skill sets would be able to topple what the status quo is. So I think one of the things that I take away from is a phenomenal example of trying to organize interracially to overcome a system that's racist. It's first and foremost. Second, for me, is the importance of history. My wife and I were joking previously that her parents moved up to the Glens Falls region in the 1970s, recreating the same sort of journey that took place to become closer to the land and become agrarian. Like, it's amazing to me that within my own family I can touch that. And I'm from Amsterdam, New York, which is about 30 miles south of the Adirondack Park. And to never have known this, as someone who studies black history and lives in that community, is astounding to me. That this was not a small-scale experiment. This was 120,000 acres is a large swath of land, right? So that part's amazing to me. And then lastly, for me, I think I mentioned this in my own comments, is that every time I learn pieces of history, it reminds me of the art of possibilities, right? Ways in which I could never have envisioned. And this exhibit in particular, there's one thing I don't like about the exhibit, which I'll tell someone at some point in time. But I love the exhibit because I never equated land to citizenship and voting. For whatever reasons, my mind didn't work that way. And so as someone who does policy, to be able to bypass the voting by giving land is just a brilliant strategy, right? And I never would have thought that way without sort of seeing an exhibit like this. And so for me, the three things would be the role of cross-racial collaboration, the importance of history, and the art of possibilities.
Well, thank you for your attention and for your comments, and please have some refreshments in the wrap room.